I was actually the Forage Extension Specialist at Penn State. So if you've been to a meeting where I look familiar, but you know I didn't work for Massey Ferguson before, that may have been where we've run across one another before. So a little bit about me. Previously, so 4 years ago, I moved to AgCo to work in product management. They realized that they needed someone with a livestock nutrition, ruminant nutrition, and forage management background to help to steer the focus of their steel and iron company into more farmer focused and to understand what you all need whenever we're talking about feeding your livestock. And they had no one on staff globally that understood forage management in terms of forage quality and the science behind it, as well as ruminant nutrition. So that's really my background with the company, and since then we have been working tirelessly in the field to do research trials to help to understand not just how we can make our machines better, but how we can help to talk to our customers and talk to farmers better to understand what it is that you need and to understand on a cellular level, on a scientific level, of what is happening within our machines. So in July of this year, I took a position as the North American marketing manager for our Massey Ferguson hay machines. So like I said, my previous position was in product management. Our product management team is global. So I was traveling globally doing research, and I decided that I wanted to stay closer to home, so I took a region of just North America. And so I just also, to give you a little bit, see, I can't introduce myself in 5 minutes. He was not wrong. And so also, I always like to start with the disclaimer of not only do I have a few degrees in what it is that I'm going to talk about today, but I also farm. And so even though I can stand here and tell you how to make better hay with the, whatever it is that you have been given, I also understand that it's important that we make hay when the sun shines, so to speak. And even though I might tell you some tips on what kind of rake to use to improve your forage quality, I also understand financial restrictions. I understand that on a very deep level. I understand weather issues on a very deep level. I understand machine breakdowns. So I always like to give that disclaimer that even though I can stand up here and talk to you about science, it's really about the practicality of it and trying to determine what can fit in best with what you've been given, with what you have to work with. And finally, I want to say that even though I'm here representing a machine company, I work for Massey Ferguson, I'm not here to sell you machines. I'm not in sales. If you have questions, I can answer your questions about our machines, and I'd be happy to point you to your nearest dealership. But I'm not here today to sell you machines. I'm here today to talk to you about forages and feeding your livestock in the best way that you possibly can. So to start off with, I think it's important that whenever we talk about forage quality as a whole, there are many, many different factors that can come into play whenever we're talking about quality. But the number one indicator is how that animal is going to perform. We're feeding several different classes of livestock, or we're making hay to suit several different classes of livestock. Is anyone in here, just out of curiosity, solely a commercial operator? So you are only growing hay or growing silage and selling it only and not feeding your livestock? Okay, we have one. So I work a lot with Western operations, and in a room that I would talk to and ask them that, it would be about 60 to 70% of those guys are only growing and making the hay and then selling it to other livestock operations. So it's just interesting how the groups of folks that I talk to vary widely across the country. But keeping that in mind, Whether you are only growing and selling, or if you're growing and feeding, there are various classes of livestock that we're targeting. And that's a whole other hour conversation in and of itself, is talking about targeting the forage quality to meet that livestock's nutritional demands. Because as they go through their stages of growth, their nutritional demands change. And they were just talking about, feeding dairy heifers corn silage. That's a perfect example of perhaps overfeeding. You're meeting their nutritional needs, but maybe a little bit too much. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Again, very briefly, because I could really get down in the weeds about that. And that's a whole other conversation, is matching that forage quality to that animal's stage of growth and that their stage of production that they're in. But like I said, the best indicator of forage quality is going to be that animal performance. And there's going to be many different things that can influence forage quality. One of those is going to be forage species. Another one is going to be forage stage of maturity. In the next slide or two, I'm going to talk pretty in depth about the stage of maturity and how you can really pay attention to that whenever you're thinking about the class of livestock that you're trying to feed. Harvest management, you're going to get sick of me talking about that by the end of the day. Fertility as well as pest incidents, and we're not going to cover that in today's talk. So I put this diagram on here. It comes directly from this feeding value publication, and I just dropped it right on here. And I know that it's really difficult to see, but I'll kind of point out what I want you to take from this. So you can see that this is kind of a web of different factors. And up here at the top, it says animal performance. So we just covered that animal performance is really the primary indicator of how good of quality our forage is. And then down here in this next section, you have all of these different variables outlining this plant-animal complex, or this plant-animal interaction. And that's really what I love to talk about all the time, and I'll do it anytime I get the chance, is talking about how that plant or that forage quality is going to affect that animal's performance. And it's something that I think about every day whenever we feed our cows, and that I argue with my dad about every day whenever we're talking about what to feed our different groups of livestock. And so over here on this bottom right is potential animal performance. So this is going to come into play all of those factors about the animal itself. So now not thinking about the forage, but thinking about the animal and thinking about what their environment is that they're in, because if they're in an environment where they are expending more energy, it doesn't matter what class they're in or what stage of production they're in, we need to up that overall nutritive value of that crop in order for them to meet their nutritional needs. So we may have a 1,300-pound cow in the western United States who is out grazing, and there they have about 70 acres per head, and she is really expelling a lot of energy to try and meet those nutritional needs. The nutritive value that's needed in her diet is significantly different than what you're going to need here in Virginia, where you can graze a cow-calf pair on about 1¼ acres typically. And so it's just really important to think about those environmental factors that are going to be significantly different based on the animal itself. But this is really what we're going to talk about today, is the potential forage feeding value. So we have the animal, we have that complex system, and then we have the forage in and of itself. And I'm going to talk to you today specifically about the nutritive values of forages. So we have all of these different interactions, but I'm going to talk to you just about this guy right here, this nutritive value within this whole complex web, to talk about how you can best improve your overall nutritive value for your livestock through harvest management. But first, let's talk a little bit about what that nutritive value means and why it's important. So this is taking a look at alfalfa stage of growth, and this is generally true regardless of forage species. So don't write it off if you don't grow alfalfa. I realize that we're starting to get out of alfalfa country down here, but this is true regardless of your forage species. You're going to see these same trends as this crop increases in its stage of production. So we have digestibility, crude protein, and intake potential. All of these factors are going to decline as that crop progresses in its stage of maturity. We're going to see an increase in dry matter and fiber as that crop progresses in its stage of maturity. And like I was talking about, the name of the game may not always to be to make the greatest quality forage as possible. Sometimes we do need to make the greatest quality forage as possible if we know that this particular cutting of hay we're trying to make for our peak lactation dairy cows. But it may be more of a balance of trying to optimize the yield while optimizing the quality. And it's really this delicate balance then of understanding, again, the class of livestock that you're feeding, what their nutritional needs are, and trying to balance that with the crop in the field. So this is taking a look at a very generic picture of a plant cell wall. And essentially what this is showing is here on the left side, you can see a early harvested forage. Again, just generally speaking. On the right side, you see a late harvested forage. One thing that I want you to notice is the cell wall size is not any different. What is different is the cell is not any different in size, but what is different is the cell wall. And as that plant continues to grow, as it continues to progress in its stage of maturity, the cell wall is going to thicken. And what we find in the cell wall are the fiber components of the plant. So generally speaking, like I just showed on the previous slide, as that plant increases in its stage of maturity, it's going to decrease in its overall digestibility potential. Another thing that's going to happen is as this plant increases and this cell wall thickens, the overall intake potential is going to be reduced. So now we have this crop increasing in its stage of maturity, and the ability for the animal to eat what she needs to eat to perform at the point at which you want her to perform is being reduced, because now she cannot physically take in as much, because her rumen motility slows down, because what her rumen is doing is trying to digest these forages as best as possible. So her intake is going to be reduced, and the overall digestibility is going to be reduced as well. So remember this different fiber components as we go through, and I talked to you a little bit more about some of these harvest management practices and how you can best preserve the nutrients that are found within your crops whenever you first go out in the field before you even mow. So I'm going to talk about this in detail a little bit later on, but to start off with, I just want to cover what is dry matter loss. We're going to talk a lot about dry matter loss in the next couple of slides. And so this is just kind of outlining what dry matter loss is at a very high level. So it could really be any of these things. It could be the literal leaf loss during harvest. It could be leaching during curing. Whenever we really see this happen pretty bad is whenever we get the super heavy dews at night, and then the sun comes out and burns it all off, and then we get another super heavy dew. We're actually losing, research has shown somewhere of up to 5 to 6% dry matter the longer we let our hay lay in the field after it has reached 20% moisture. So keep that in mind. We want to get that baled as quick as we can once it gets down to the optimal baling moisture. Leaching due to precipitation, we'll talk about that in detail in just a minute. microbial utilization of carbohydrates, and as well as the denaturing of proteins with heating. And we're going to cover all those things. So NDF, why does it matter? I talked about fiber. So NDF, if you get a forage sample, is going to be an indication on your sample analysis of the total cell wall components of the sample that you sent in. So it's going to be comprised of lignin, cellulose, and hemicellulose. Within those components, lignin is almost, not always, but almost completely indigestible. Cellulose and hemicellulose are moderately digestible. So what we typically see is anywhere from a 40 to 70% digestibility of those cell wall components. Now, whenever you're taking a look at your forage analysis report, don't just look at the NDF, also look at the NDF digestibility. And what that's going to give you is an indicator. It's going to give you a percent of how digestible only this portion of the crop is going to be. And like I said, it's probably going to range somewhere in the 40 to 70% range. So why is NDF important? Like I said earlier, NDF is negatively correlated with intake, with the ability for that animal to consume what it needs. It's easy to remember because the N and NDF and intake. So as that NDF increases, as that plant increases in its stage of maturity, intake potential of that forage goes down. ADF. ADF is a proportion that's also analyzed, and it is the lignin and cellulose portion of a plant. And it's important on your forage analysis because it is directly correlated with, negatively correlated with digestibility. So as ADF increases, the overall digestibility of a crop goes down. Both NDF and ADF can be affected by your harvest management practices as well. So keep that in mind. So in other words here, so I talked about forage species being a huge indicator of the differences in overall forage quality potential. And this tells you why right here in a very elementary type format, trying to break down that cell in fractions in terms of what is available within that cell. So in the large rectangular boxes that I showed a couple of slides ago, you had the thick outside wall or the gray wall. That is an indicator of the fiber. But what we found on the inside portion of that cell are what we call cell solubles. They may look like NFC, NSC, or WSC on your output. Water-soluble carbohydrates is something that I will talk about here in just a minute for one of our research trials. But these cell contents, this red portion that you're seeing here, are almost entirely digestible within the animal. So that's why that thickening of the cell wall and that increase in fiber, even though we're not getting a change in the total cell size, we're getting an increase in that fiber component and a reduction in the overall digestibility and intake potential of that crop. So if we're starting out already with a legume, it has the higher possibility of digestibility compared to a grass crop. And that's just biological. That's just how God made it, with more cell content within the cell, or highly digestible, we'll say, cell contents within the cell of a legume versus a grass. And then you can see here the differences in the fiber components as well of a grass versus a legume. So if we have this little itty bitty NDF portion of a legume, now knowing what you know about NDF, which of these two are we going to say, a grass versus a legume, does that animal have better intake potential? Legume, perfect. So that's why a lot of the times, it doesn't matter if we're talking about alfalfa, we're talking about clover, veg, peas, whatever, we're going to see an improvement in animal performance because of this cell wall reduction and the increased ability for her to consume more. So this is why a lot of dairy nutritionists, and dairy nutritionists are very divided on this, but a lot of them still like to see alfalfa fractions within the diet because of that fiber component that's found within that legume crop. Or maybe you're grazing and you have a lot of clover found within your pasture. Same effect, same legume type of crop. So this is taking a look at advances in alfalfa maturity. And if you look over here on the right side, you have your NDF and your ADF proportion as that crop increases in stage of maturity. So we're starting out with vegetative in terms of its stage of production, going to bud, early bloom, late bloom, and then going to seed. And what I'd like you to notice is how that NDF proportion continues to increase as that plant continues to increase in its stage of production. So now we went from a very digestible crop, from a high intake potential crop, high digestibility, down to just moderate. And so that's important to think about whenever you're balancing that yield versus quality. And I put this on here, it says more leaves equals better quality. And even though we're talking about grasses versus legumes in the previous slide, it's important to understand that leaf shatter also can happen in grasses. And the highest nutritive proportion of the plant, regardless of the plant species, is going to be found in the leaves. So the name of the game, whenever we're talking about harvested forages, and I'm not telling you guys anything that you already don't know, is preserving the quality that is already in the plant. Because whenever we're talking about harvested forages, it's really a losing game. You're never going to get better quality forage than what is standing in the field before you mow it. We're not talking about grazing, where the animal's going out and doing the harvesting for you. So whatever she's consuming is what she's going to have the availability to utilize. Now we have to go through multiple mechanical processes to get that forage harvested and stored. So keep that in mind. The name of the game is doing it as quickly as possible, and I'm going to tell you why in just a minute, but while preserving as many leaves as possible, because that's going to be where our highest digestibility proportion of the plant is going to be. I'm going to talk about this again at length. I think I shared this 4 more times in this presentation, but essentially what this is showing here is the percent dry matter loss. So the total dry matter loss in correlation with the moisture at which you're harvesting your crop. So you can see the greater the moisture percent when harvested, the greater the overall storage losses are going to be incurred. And then the drier at which you're harvesting your forage, the greater the harvest losses you're going to have. And we're going to talk about how to balance that the best in a little while as well. Okay, so let's talk about harvest management effects on forage quality, and I'm going to go down through and just go through each of the different processes. So let's start out with mowing. Oh, and once again, if we go through and talk about what the different types of dry matter losses are, we can talk about the actual leaves being shattered, causing dry matter loss, and these are just flat out not baled or not chopped. Leaching during curing, leaching during precipitation, and this is literal dry matter yield is going to be lost and washed away. microbial utilization of carbohydrates. The carbohydrates are utilized from the microbes in the plant prior to ingestion by the animal. And I'm not talking about necessarily fermentation here. I'm talking about harvesting and storing at the incorrect moisture and having some of that microbial activity occurring, and the carbohydrates are literally utilized by the microbes that are within that plant, and then that's going to cause heating of the plant or of the hay. And that's whenever we get the denaturing of proteins with our heating. So now we're getting microbes utilizing those highly digestible carbohydrates, and we're getting heating. So now we're getting a reduction in the total amount of protein that's available for that animal within that plant as well. And so whenever, I always caution people, whenever you get your forage analysis, don't just look at the crude protein content. As well, under that or beside it, depending on where you get your forages analyzed, look at the percent availability of that protein. Hopefully it's going to be in the 96 to 99% range, meaning that the protein that's available, the nitrogen that's available within that plant, is highly utilizable by that animal. Whenever we see heating of the crop, then we see denaturing of those proteins. So you may have an 18% crude protein value within that sample that you sent in, but because it heated at some point during storage, you may only have an 88% available protein. Because whenever you send your sample to the lab, all they're looking for in terms of a nitrogen analysis is or in terms of a crude protein analysis, is the percent nitrogen found within that plant. So percent crude protein of your forage sample may not be entirely indicative of the availability for utilization of that crude protein or of that protein, the nitrogen found within the plant. All right, so let's start breaking down some of these different harvest practices and a few of the trials that I've done with the company over the last few years since being with AGCO. So one of our, like I said, one of the things that we're constantly trying to do is to determine what questions do you all have? How can we better help you to solve your problems? And then how can we translate that into a usable form for you to take home and be able to apply right away? And when talking to some of our field product specialists about what are some issues that farmers run into while mowing, one of the things that they said is just flat out incorrectly running the machine at the wrong PTO speed. We may have unskilled operators on there. Maybe you have someone that is available to mow one afternoon for you while you're over, I don't know, building fence or something. And so you throw someone on your mower and you don't tell them what to set the RPM at. You don't tell them the speed at which you want them to go. And so we wanted to see also labor availability. We hear that all across the country of how they're constantly having labor turnover, having issues with labor retention, and just unskilled labor. People, just don't know how to operate equipment anymore. And so what we took a look at was, so with our pull type mowers, we recommend anywhere from a 520 to a 540 PTO RPM. So we also ran this at 420 and 620. So we could see what the incorrect PTO speed, how much crop residue we're leaving out in the field. And you can see that it will add up very, very quickly. And so we had these set at 3-inch mowing height. And so you can see that we got about a 2/3 a ton per acre residue left in the field above that 3-inch mowing height when we ran that PTO to slow. And whenever we ran it too fast, we had almost a 1 ton left in the field. Now, I do need to make a disclaimer, that sounds like a lot of forage, but this was a super, super dense crop that we had up in Canton, New York, in the northern part of New York, and it was heavy grass. So there was a lot of grass out there. But we still saw really negative effects of residual left in the field after mowing when running that machine incorrectly. Interestingly enough, and this is not good to take home to your sons, but if you're running that machine at the proper PTO speed, we saw no difference in residue left in the field at different ground speeds. So the name of the game is, as long as you're running at the proper PTO, I know, everybody's laughing. As long as you're running at the proper PTO speed, go ahead and run that thing at 8 miles an hour and you'll be fine, as long as you don't have groundhog holes. And so another thing that we are always very, very curious about, and it is one of the main conversations that I have with farmers, is about dry down rate. I promise you, it does not matter where I have been across the globe. Whenever I'm talking to customers or farmers about what are some of your problems, what would you like us to help you improve, they say, make my hay dry faster. I mean, they say that in Yuma, Arizona. I am not kidding. I go down there to those guys where it's like dry as a bone. And I say, how can we help you? What features can we improve? And they say, make my hay dry faster. And I'm gonna prove to you why it's important to make your hay dry as fast as possible. So essentially what's happening whenever we mow our hay, whenever we remove that plant from its root system, is it goes into survival mode. So whenever it is connected to its root, it's happy, it's growing, it is utilizing sun energy and transforming that into a usable form of energy for our livestock. And so whenever we remove it from its root system, it goes into survival mode. It's now panicking and it is burning up those carbohydrates that I just spoke so highly of a few slides ago. Now our crop is trying to save itself and burning up all of those carbohydrates. Where we really see the most significant reduction in respiration is whenever it hits that 20% moisture. So our goal is, if we're making dry hay, is to get that crop down to 20% moisture as fast as possible. And the faster that you can do that, the higher your quality will be. That has been shown over and over and over again. So that's a scientifically proven fact. The faster you can get that hay to 20% moisture, the greater your forage quality will be. Now we know we can't necessarily bale that hay at 20% moisture unless you're using an additive, a preservative, an inoculant of some sort. But we still have to let it continue curing in the field before we can bale it for dry hay. But the goal is that 20% range. One of the ways in which to get your hay as dry as quickly as possible is going to be conditioning. And believe it or not, I have even more slides and more studies that we've done on conditioning than what I'm going to share with you today. But this is a trial that was done by my predecessor in my previous position at Penn State, Marvin Hall. I don't know if any of you guys have ever ran across him. He was in extension for many, many years, doing presentations all along the mid-Atlantic United States. And this was just a general trial where he looked at conditioning with a roller conditioner versus not conditioning. And you can see here the time gap at which that crop dried down faster than unconditioned. This past summer, we did a trial in Southeast PA. We have done a lot of trials in Southeast PA, so forgive me for continually saying that throughout this presentation. But essentially what we wanted to look at was steel-on-steel conditioners versus not conditioning in grass. Because typical theory has been, if you have a solid grass operation, you want a tine or impeller conditioner, because that's going to do the best at slicing the cuticle on the waxy stem and in the leaves to dissipate that moisture out of that crop. So what we did was we had a steel-on-steel conditioner, and we were actually doing a tedder trial. But we had to mow the hay, so I was like, we're going to do a mower trial while we're out here as well in this grass, because I wanted to see if it had any effect on the dry down in grass, and we saw that indeed it did. It had, it got to our ideal baling moisture faster, and we also saw the predicted improvement in overall quality. So that is a roller conditioner in an entirely grass crop in southeast Pennsylvania in July. So this is just taking a look again. I was just talking a little bit about the differences in conditioner types. So typically, it's been kind of conventional thought that our grasses will do better with impeller or tine type conditioners, and our legumes or stemmy forages will do much better with a roller type of conditioner. So a couple of years ago, we were in Green Forest, Arkansas, again, trying to compare conditioner types within grass species. Because if you're going to see the effect in grass, it's going to be even magnified in a legume with the denser stem. And so what we took a look at was a steel-on-steel, rubber-on-rubber, and a tine or impeller conditioner. And even though we used 3 different brands in this trial, the goal for this study was not a brand comparison. I can't tell you which mower did a better job at mowing the crop. The goal was to look at the differences in the conditioning types, because we at Massey Ferguson sell all of these conditioning types. We have tine conditioners, we have rubber on rubber, we have steel on steel, and we have rubber on steel. And we get the question all the time, what do I buy? What is best for my operation? And I always, this data was not out there previously, looking at these different conditioner type comparisons. But I always go back to longevity and reliability. And I always talk about steel-on-steel conditioners, even though there is a slight upcharge for those because of the longevity. They last forever. And if you're talking about rubber-on-rubber conditioners, you're still going to get conditioning. It's a different type of conditioning versus steel-on-steel, but those only last a few years before you need to replace the rolls, because you get a lot of wear. And eventually, if you put your conditioning rolls together, you'll be able to see a gap in between those rubber-on-rubber conditioners, and now you're not getting optimum conditioning. So now you're burning a lot of fuel and you're wasting a lot of horsepower, and you're not getting the effect that you need to get in terms of your dry down rate for your crops. So this was truly just an experiment with the mowers that we had available. All of them had the same width cutter bar, and yeah, we wanted to compare and see what the differences were. And we actually did see an improvement in the dry down rate with looking at the steel-on-steel versus the other two. One other thing that I want to talk about here very quickly before we move on is the differences in the way that the rubber and steel condition the crop. So I did not get to do this in alfalfa, and I wish I would have. We didn't have alfalfa available in central Arkansas. And so if you look in an alfalfa field with rubber on rubber conditioning rolls, If you go out 4 to 6 hours after you mow and you pick up that alfalfa stem and look at the leaves, there is bruising. And there's a lot of dark spots all over those leaves. It hasn't been looked at, but I suspect that what you're getting is the leaching of those very high quality nutrients that we just talked about, and what is dry matter loss and what are some ways that our forage quality can be reduced is leaching of the nutrients. And I'm suspecting that the crushing that occurs with rubber on rubber also can reduce the overall forage quality. The effect that we see with steel on steel is simply crimping. It doesn't have that thick rubber in there to crush the plant. It's just simply crimping it. I actually do have a picture of it here a little bit later. So that's also a strong suspicion of mine as well whenever we get into our very high quality crops and we're looking at the rubber on rubber versus steel on steel. Again, keep in mind, we sell all of these, so I'm not talking smack against any brand specifically. This is truly for us to see what to talk to our farmers about whenever they're making this decision. And so we saw an improvement in the dry down rate. We saw no difference in quality for in these grasses whenever we were looking at the steel on steel versus rubber on rubber. Slight reduction in total digestible nutrients with the impeller conditioner, which I also found very interesting because, like I said, conventional wisdom has told us that impeller conditioners are going to help to retain the nutrients that are found within that grass crop better. Not the same with a legume, but with a grass. And so this actually showed the opposite. So far we're like really building a case for steel on steel. Whenever we're talking about the crude protein differences, a slight increase again with our steel on steel versus rubber on rubber or impeller. And we saw just a slight reduction with our impeller in this case. So that was a very interesting study that we found some things we did not know what we were going to find, and we found some very interesting results in that, giving us a good case to talk about steel on steel conditioning rolls whenever we're making that decision for any type of farming operation. Does anybody in here use a self-propelled windrower or a swather to mow? Okay. All right, we got a light crowd. Do you use a Heston? Nice.
I could.
Do you have a double conditioner?
I do.
Okay, perfect. Well, you'll like these. You'll like this next study then. Okay, so we offer in our self-propelled windrowers a double conditioner option. It's called a twin max system. And if you take a look at this little diagram here, you can see that there is 2 sets of conditioning rolls within our header for our swather or windrower. Or it's all very geographically dependent on whether you call it a swather or a windrower. So this crop is actually going through and getting crimped twice, rather than just one, which is the option in our pull type mowers. And so instead of getting crimped every 3 to 4 inches, the stem is getting crimped every 1.5 to 2 inches. You would think that would reduce your total dry down time. But like I said, they did not have a researcher on staff prior to. And so this makes a lot of sense that by double crimping your stem, it would reduce the overall dry down time. So we went out in Wisconsin in June, whenever it was the muggiest time of the year. That was our goal, actually, was to have not great dry down weather so that we could actually see if this thing worked or not. And we wanted to compare the dry down rates of a single conditioner, this double conditioner twin max option that we have, with no conditioning at all. So we did do a control. And what we found was in these not ideal dry down conditions, the twin max double conditioner got us in the field 5 to 6 hours sooner compared to the single conditioner option. So we were on a dairy farm, we were in alfalfa, and he wanted to make some dry hay. He typically did not make a lot of dry hay, but because he had 4 people there in the field making his hay for him, he was like, sure, we'll make some dry hay. And so our goal was to bale this at 15% moisture, round bales. And so we got that double conditioned crop down to 15%, 5 to 6 hours sooner than single conditioned. Interestingly enough, we could not get the not conditioned alfalfa to the correct temperature, or yeah, the correct temperature, the correct moisture, before we had to catch flights home. So we actually literally ran out of time to let that hay dry before we had to leave. And he was like, whatever, just bale it up, I'll wrap it. He had, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of tons of wrapped hay already. So he was like, sure, I'll just throw it in and we'll just wrap this. So that in and of itself is a testament for conditioning your hay to reduce the overall dry down rate. Now let's talk a little bit about nutrients. Keep in mind, we had dry hay that we analyzed for the single and double conditioned crop, and we had 35% moisture hay that we analyzed for the unconditioned. So we saw an improvement by almost 2% total digestible nutrients or digestibility in that crop by using the double conditioner versus a single conditioner or no conditioning at all. If you're talking about animal performance, a 2% improvement in digestibility is extremely significant. That's going to give you an improvement in animal performance every time. Or it's going to cause her to not have to consume as much hay to meet her nutrient requirements. So either way, it's a win-win. And if we're talking about relative feed value, again, I want to point out that here we're comparing dry hay that was baled at 15% moisture. I actually think it was 14% moisture for our double conditioned versus our 35% moisture for our no conditioned. And we still saw an improvement in relative feed value for our double conditioned option. Another way, if you do not have a conditioner, is to widen your swath at mowing. So we're going to recommend a 70 to 80%, especially since I know most of you in here are using pull type mowers, a 70 to 80% swath width of your cutter bar. We're going to try to widen that as much as possible and lay that swath out as wide as possible so that we can optimize our solar radiation and try to get that dry as quickly as possible. And that's what this study here by Dan Understander was showing, was just by having that wide versus narrow swath. He had a 35 or 40%, his cutter bar width was what his narrow swath was, and 75% his cutter bar width for his wide swath. And he got very, very significant 24-hour difference in his dry down rate to get that down to that magic 20% number.
Did you have a protein comparison on those conditioning and double and single conditioning? Okay.
Oh, on the double and single conditioning?
No conditioning.
Yes, I did. I skipped over it because nobody in here was using, but yes. So we had no difference in our single versus double conditioned for protein content. We had 1% higher for our not conditioned, but it was 35% moisture forage, so it's going to have a higher percent protein. But yep, we saw again no difference. So no reduction by that. And I meant to say that. So they built this double conditioner, engineers, knowing that we need to get this crop dry as quickly as possible. And I come in as the animal nutritionist thinking, if we have all of this mechanical handling, this additional, going through this additional conditioning system. Is this actually reducing the forage quality? So that was my fear going into the trial, was that we're gonna have this claim to fame twin max double conditioner, and we actually see a reduction in forage quality. But luckily that's not what we saw. We only saw improvement. And so again, a 24-hour improvement with this wide swath versus narrow swath with no conditioning. And this is taking a look at crude protein differences with the wide swath versus narrow swath, as well as hours to dry. And here they were just making high moisture hay to 65% moisture. And you know, we've been going from place to place this week, and so I've talked to several different crowds, and it seems like all of the questions are, or the answers to all of the questions are, well, it depends on weather. It depends on your weather outlook. And this is exactly what this is showing as well, are the benefits of laying a wide swath if maybe you don't have ideal weather conditions. And it's showing that this is still beneficial. Okay, rainfall. It's always a hot topic whenever you talk about hay production, and you know, farmers like to talk about the rain and their hay, and it is a challenge. And it is becoming more of a challenge. And essentially the long and short of what this is showing here, this is actually derived, it is a slide from my predecessor Marvin Hall, but it's actually derived from a Mike Collins study in Kentucky. And what this is showing is the drier your hay, if it gets rained on, the more damage it will incur. So if you're up against the weather and you have the option to wrap your hay, but you know, you're not quite sure what to do, it's always best to get that hay off of the field before the rain comes. However, if you're dodging thunderstorms and you need to get hay made, it's always best to mow as close to that rain as possible. So if you mow and you have a very wet crop laying in the field and it gets rained on an hour and a half later, don't lose sleep over it. It's fine, everything's fine. Especially if you have the option to go out and ted it out in the morning. It's gonna dry down just fine and you're not gonna lose quality from that. You might lose a little bit, but you know, nothing to lose sleep over it. Now, if you have hay that is 16% moisture, and you're thinking about baling it the next morning after the dew burns off and it gets rained on, that's whenever you're talking about really, really serious losses and turning a good hay into practically mulch at that point. Because that rain, and again, it depends on if it's a shower or a heavy rain, is really gonna do a number on that dry crop with washing away all of those soluble nutrients that I was just talking about. Another hot topic is ash. Man, we're just looking at my time, Dave. So another hot topic is ash, especially whenever I'm talking to dairy farmers. And so just a very brief overview of what ash is. Essentially, it is any inorganic compound that's found within hay. So it's important to understand whenever, again, you're looking at your forage analysis and you're trying to decipher exactly what does all of this mean. It also encompasses your vitamins and minerals in this one lump sum of ash percentage. So our grasses innately are going to have an 8% ash content at minimum. They may have 9% depending on management. They may have 10% depending on management. Our legumes are going to have 6% ash content innately. That's just your vitamins and minerals. It may have 7, it may have 8, again, depending on management. So you are never going to get your ash percentage down to 0 because there's vitamins and minerals found within that plant that are good for your animal. And anything that we are seeing above a 6 to 7% for our legumes, and above an 8 to 9% for our grasses is going to be contamination. It's going to be soil contamination. It's going to be dirt in your hay or in your silage. And so why this is important is ash has a 1-to-1 displacement ratio with digestibility. So it was shown that it's actually 1 to like 0.98, so almost exactly 1-to-1. So as that ash percent increases above the innately available vitamins and minerals within that crop, the overall digestibility of that crop is going to be reversed at the same ratio. So if you have a 10% ash concentration in a grass, you're going to have a 2% reduction in your overall digestibility potential of that plant. So that's why it's important.
Did you work that out in your DMR?
Yeah, so he asked, can you work that out in your TMR? Yep, and so that's going to have to be what you do then, is to adjust your TDN based on your other feedstuffs that you're adding in.
Soil splash from Sudan soil.
Yeah. Was it like 13%?
Not 14.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I run it through the DMR.
And
Corn
then-
salad.
Exactly. So you would want to then balance that to a higher TDN level. Yep. Yep. You did the right thing. He said he had soil splash on his sorghum, and that happens all the time. So what we wanted to look at was the correlation of mowing height to ash concentration. That's actually another, I hadn't thought to think about that, but that's actually a management practice. Is if you have flooding in your field. We have a couple of creek bottom fields that get flooding every couple of years, and that is just to raise your cutter bar as much as possible to try and reduce that ash incorporation into your crop. Lodging is hard though, right? With our crops. Oh, 10? Oh, good, okay. So I thought that you were doing this to say, come see me to talk about forages that don't lodge.
Oh, yeah.
So see Dave
Yeah, no,
if you have trouble with lodging.
I was trying to give her a timing thing. but
No, it's okay.
It's all sales, but you're right.
I know, I thought you were like, come see me. So with our small grains, we see a lot of lodging often. And that is whenever we're seeing a lot of ash incorporation into our feed as well. So this trial was not done by us. And we were very interested. We get questions on ash all the time as well with making mowers. On what is the correlation between mowing height and ash incorporation into the crop. And what we found was only one previous trial where they looked at all of these different stubble heights, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, and they found no difference after raising that cutter bar from 1.5 to 2. Well, we like to talk to farmers about good land management and good stand management and stand longevity, and not just for us making money, but for you guys making money as well is always at the top of our priority list. And so I actually redid a trial this past summer. I haven't gotten any slides made on it yet, but we looked at 1/2 inch, 2, 3.5, and 5 mowing height, because I wanted to see, is there a benefit once we get way up to 5 inches of still seeing a reduction in ash content? And the threshold for us was so at 0.5 and 2, we saw no difference. We saw a greater ash incorporation. But then whenever we got up to that 3.5, we did see a reduction in overall ash incorporation. And that's really where we're going to recommend grazing. That's where we're going to recommend mowing, is going to be between that 3 to 4 inch stubble height. So that's really good to know that if you're managing that stand properly, you're still getting lesser ash incorporation into your crop as well. I have very little on tedding, but we've actually done quite a bit more than what I'm sharing here on tedding, which I'd be happy to talk to you about after I present if you're interested. But really, the name of the game with tedding, still, as with mowing, is going to be getting that crop dried down as quickly as possible. That's why we invented tedders, is so we can get that crop dried down as quickly as possible. And, excuse me, in this trial done by the University of Minnesota, they found that regardless of cutting, first, second, or third cutting, they saw an improvement in water-soluble carbohydrates by using a tedder versus not. We actually saw similar results of looking at time of tedding, and that actually then led to a conversation of time of mowing, because we went out and we tried to ted at all of these different times across the day, and we saw that regardless of whether we tedded at 0 hours after mowing or 4 hours after mowing or 8 hours after mowing, what actually gave us the biggest significance was the time of mowing. And so we mowed at 10 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and 5 o'clock. And the 1 o'clock, regardless of time of tedding, dried down faster every time. So that was actually, you know, whenever you do research, you set out to find one thing and then you get like 4 more questions or 100 more questions. And that's exactly what happened. But we also saw now we have more to talk about whenever we can talk about time of mowing during the day is going to be most beneficial if you're mowing right smack dab in the middle of the day whenever we're talking about dry down rate. We can also have the conversation of forage quality as well, but I'm running low on time and I still have raking and baling to talk about. Okay. So this is one that I dread. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So you said you talk about the quality. Talk about the quality. Was the
Okay.
quality better?
Okay.
At 1 o'clock?
Okay, I'll talk about it, fine. I'm not going to make it to 10 minutes. You might tell them in the back.
Because they're gonna eat.
Okay.
It's good weather, we'll want.
Okay, so this is weather dependent. Is whether or not your quality is going to be greater in the afternoon, if you mow in the afternoon, versus if you mow in the morning. And we are in a very tricky region here in the Mid-Atlantic because we also battle humidity. And with humidity, you get increased respiration. Yay. And so, like I was saying, those guys in Yuma, they're like, make my hay dry faster. And I'm like, you should see where we make hay. Like, we have some issues. So, if you clip a plant sample in the morning and in the afternoon and look at the forage analysis of it right then, undoubtedly what you clipped in the afternoon is going to have better nutritive value. It's going to have more sugars. What we run into is mowing in the afternoon, letting it lay in the humidity and not in ideal drying conditions, and it respiring. And then the sun the sun sets, and then the dew sets in, and that plant is respiring. And it's burning up all of those additional sugars that it accumulated during the day. And now it actually has a longer opportunity to respire and burn up those carbohydrates than what the crop had if we had mowed at 10 in the morning. And it now is laying in the sunshine. We widen our swath, it's laying in the sunshine, and it is actually having a reduction in respiration faster than what that crop that was cut in the afternoon is going to have. So this was a trial that was done, again, in Wisconsin by Dr. Dan Undersander. I show so much of his data on here, but he is like the pioneer of hay research in the modern day. And the moral of the story is, if you have a very good drying day, if you have low humidity, and we have them, If you have low humidity, a light breeze, and lots of solar radiation, you will get a benefit in terms of forage quality by mowing in the afternoon. If you have high humidity, it's not calling for rain, but you're still having high humidity, you're going to get an increase in respiration rate, and you're not going to see a benefit to forage quality by mowing in the afternoon. Answer your question?
Yeah, so then one other thing is, if you mow with dew on, it's probably not.
No, mowing with dew doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter?
No. So again, the biggest thing with mowing early in the morning is going to be trying to get the soil moisture out of the soil. So let it lay in the swath, let that soil moisture dissipate, and then ted it out. Where if you mow in the middle of the day, we found that you can ted right away, and because there's not as much soil moisture, and so you're going to get that increased dry down rate because you're not letting it lay in the swath. But in terms of quality, mowing with dew on it isn't going to reduce your quality. It might reduce your efficacy of your cutter bar because you're mowing wet hay, but it won't reduce your quality.
So mowing in the evening, you do one thing, and then come ted in the morning is actually not bad.
No, I would not do that. I would let the dew burn off of it before you ted it.
Right.
Let the soil. Yes,
But if you
that's fine.
Mow in the evening, they keep the few ones going to midnight, whatever. And then in the morning, when the dew's off, kick it out. You're saying what's bad is when you mow it with dew on it, and during the day, it's trying to get that.
Respiration.
Gotcha.
Yep. Okay, so let's very quickly talk about rake types. I'm going to buzz through this, but we could talk more about it individually if you guys have questions. So far, I'm doing the worst today, Dave. With
See what I have here?
okay.
I'm gonna save a little
Okay,
lamb.
so this is taking a look at leaf content and rake type. And essentially what they found was mergers had the greatest retention of leaves, followed by rotary and sidebar rakes, and then with wheel rakes having the worst leaf retention. So what we wanted to take a look at was rotary rakes in the ashiest soil we could find in North America. So we went up to the northwestern United States where they have volcanic ash soils in like eastern Washington and Idaho, where we have a lot of commercial hay production. It's actually the heaviest area for commercial hay production in the United States.
Cut to the slide that shows the gist of the matter. Come on.
Well, I
Show
want to tell them the background of it. Okay, so this is taking a look at ash content after baling, looking at a rotary rake, a Darth wheel rake, or a twin star basket rake. And what we wanted to see was, is there any difference in ash content if we're looking at these three different rakes? And what we saw was across all of our different ground speeds going across the field, that our rotary rake actually had the least incorporation of ash across all of our different treatments. I'll skip this one. I'll skip these. Okay, round bale silage. Show of hands, how many in here are feeding bale silage of some sort? Okay, I suspected it was probably the majority of you all. This is just taking a look at what a great improvement of having bale silage over dry hay in the same field is showing. So we talk a lot about trying to battle weather. This is an excellent option in variable climates for battling weather and trying to get the highest quality forage as possible. Because we're talking about having to dry our hay down to 15% to bale it. Now we only have to dry it down to 45 to 60% moisture. And because we have the risk of all of this leaf loss as our hay gets drier, now we have the opportunity to retain those leaves with the higher moisture silage. And so you can see here with our targeted 45 to 60% moisture range, that's going to be the best combination of our storage losses and our harvest losses. Okay, very quickly, we have this cool little combi wrapper that is going to wrap the bale before it hits the ground after it's been baled. And what we wanted to see was earlier in, again, another Dan Undersander study showed that we want to wrap our bales within 24 hours after baling. What we wanted to look at was, is there any benefit to wrapping earlier than 24 hours? So we looked at wrapping immediately out of the ProTech baler, 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, and then 24 hours after baling. And what we actually found was that there is an improvement if you can wrap less than 8 hours after baling and get an improvement in overall forage quality or digestibility. They replicated this trial in France and actually found that that break was somewhere between the 4 hour and 8 hour mark. So moral of the story, and I'll end here, is whenever you're making baleage and you often think, oh, I have a full 24 hours, and they actually did a 48-hour trial or treatment as well in Europe, because it's kind of conventional wisdom over there that you have 2 days after baling to wrap your bales. They actually found more significant results that you actually have between 4 and 8 hours if you want to see a really good boost in your overall forage quality. So keep that in mind as you're wrapping your bales. The faster you can get those wrapped after baling, the better, regardless of the type of wrapper that you're using.
Put your contact information up there, get to that slide.
See, we got a lot more still.
I thought the cooler temperature would speed yourself up, but I guess it slowed you down.
All right, here's my email address that if you're interested, I can give you my phone number as well. I don't have it memorized, my work phone.
But you can get
But
a
I-
copy of these slides, like if there was some information in there, you said, I
Yeah.
really like that, I didn't catch it all, I didn't get a chance to snap a snapshot, it's not proprietary.
Yep.
She can email you a PDF. And if you don't have technology, but you have someone like a dealer that may have that technology, touch base with them, and if you really want it, we can make sure you get it. Or the
Yep.
home office, if nothing else.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, none of this is confidential information, so I can share it all with you. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah,
I
thank you
think
guys.
15 more minutes.